Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Inside Guns with your host, me, the Yankee Marshal. Today's episode is going to be a little different because instead of doing a main topic and then doing gun talk, I'm just going to do two segments of gun talk. It's going to be a gun talk episode because I want to address a question that came up again in my live chat tonight and I've received via email a couple of times in the past week. It's a question I've addressed before, but I want to address it again here. The question is, how many rounds do you have to put through a gun, a new gun, before it can be considered reliable enough to carry? Is it 500 like some people say, 1,000 like some people say? There's even some people that say 2,000 rounds. And people are like, well, how many do I actually need to put through a new gun? Because it'd be kind of hard to put that many rounds through a new gun now before being able to carry it because ammo is so scarce. So they want to know how many rounds do I have to put through it before it's safe. Well, first, I want to tell you something. People that tell you you need these large break-in periods for guns, that's generally not the case anymore, period. They are working on outdated data. And I'll explain to you here why that's so. Back in the day, you could not mass-produce parts that fit together perfectly. You had to hand-fit parts together. Guns had to be hand-fit to a degree. So gunsmiths had to take every piece that came off the conveyor belts and fit them together. And sometimes when you're doing multiple guns, especially when you're trying to mass produce guns, you don't have time to fit them perfectly. So, and plus you don't want to err on the side of taking off too much material because then your guns are rattly and crappy. So what they would do is they would just quickly fit them together and they would err on the side of making them a little too tight than making them too loose. Unless it was like a government gun going off to war. That's why they rattled like a can of pennies when you shook them. Because they didn't want them to have a break-in period and they didn't want them to be fine precision machines. They just had to function. Didn't matter if they were rattly and loose. So they would err on the side of leaving a little bit too much material. And then they would say, make sure you shoot it for a while to wear it in first. And that's why you had to put a lot of rounds through a gun. If you bought a gun that was a nicer gun, like a 1911 the collector's level 1911 or other, semi-automatic guns. Not so much revolvers as semi-autos because revolvers don't have to have as much math in them as semi-autos do. Because with a semi-auto, you got to figure out how much resistance can be on that slide, both spring weight and fit. If it's actually rubbing together, that creates resistance that can slow a slide down. Slides have to travel at a certain speed to be able to cycle properly. Spring's got to give the right amount of resistance. It's got to have the right caliber that provides as much energy to move it. It's just a big mathematical equation to get it right. So if the gun was just a little bit too tight, well, that would screw up that equation. So the gun might jam a lot. So they would tell you, if it jams the first couple hundred rounds, just keep working them through and it'll eventually even out. A lot of people, when they first get their guns, they'd put lapping compound in them and rack them a lot. That was one way of wearing them in. But today, these days, most guns are CNC machined. And those CNC machines can make 50 slides and 50 frames that any one of them can go with the other and they'll match perfectly. We're talking, differences measured in microns. So that hand fitting isn't required anymore on a lot of guns. Unless they're using like an old style of production because they want to be nostalgic or because they're, wanting to make a gun that's super custom, not mass produced, they really don't need the hand fitting anymore. It's not a big deal, as big a deal as it used to be. And the same thing with break-in periods. Since these guns don't have to be made in a way that errs on the side of leaving too much material, they can be made to fit perfectly. You don't really have to break them in. All you have to do is quality test, basically. You just have to go out, take your gun, put a box of ammo through it, a 50-round box. If you don't see any immediate, obvious defects or flaws, you're probably not going to see any at all. If you do see some, that doesn't mean your gun is bad right off the bat. Put another 50 through it. See if it works itself out. Most manufacturers recommend you shoot a gun a certain number of rounds before you call them as it for being defective, not because the guns actually need to break in anymore, but a lot of times when people get a new gun, they do things wrong, they limp wrist, they do other things wrong, they use a bad ammo, etc. So they want you to shoot a lot of rounds to them to make sure it just wasn't user error before you send it back. But as far as a break-in period, most gunsmiths that work for manufacturers now will tell you that it is not even really needed. Just quality check your gun when you get it to check for defects, because a defect is far more likely than a poorly fit gun these days. And that's not likely at all either, but it's more likely than having a poorly fit gun unless you're buying a really cheaply produced gun. Most quality guns will be fine right out of the box. Glocks are fine right out of the box. M&Ps are generally fine right out of the box. 1911s generally fine right out of the box these days. The only exception I've had on a newer gun is I got a Les Baer once that was so tight that it had to shoot a few hundred rounds through it before it would actually cycle properly, because it was so tight you could push the slide halfway back and let go and it would stay there. It was very tight. And when you're wanting something like that, when you want like almost no lines in the back, you want those to be so precise, that's a way to do that. Make it a little too tight and then wear it in. But most production guns made for carry don't require any massive break-in periods anymore, especially not 1,000 or more rounds. And in fact, if you can put, like I said, put 50 rounds of range ammo through it, and then maybe put a dozen rounds of your carry ammo through it, and if that gun shoots both of them reliably, you're pretty good to go. That's just the truth of modern manufacturing when it comes to firearms. That whole thing when people go, they don't make them like they used to. I'm always like, yeah, they make them much better. And if you argue, then you don't know anything about manufacturing. The reason they all had to be hand fit and stuff in the old days, like I said, is because manufacturing sucked. Now, manufacturing is freaking awesome. We can mass produce things so easily that fit. So if your question is, how many rounds do you have to put through your gun before you trust it? Well, that's up to you. You might be someone that has to put a lot of rounds through your gun before you trust it, but I would give you a little advice here. If you do have a gun, I've heard people tell me before, I got to put 2,000 or 3,000 rounds for a gun before I'll start carrying it. If you do have a piece in your gun that might wear out, that is, there's a chance that eventually it'll break on you when you need it. Well, if you put 3,000 or 4,000 rounds through it before you carry it, you have probably reduced the life of that part to where it could go any day. So you might be actually increasing the chances of having a failure with your carry gun. Because most manufacturers will tell you some certain parts might start wearing out at around 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 rounds. So you're basically wearing your gun out before you carry it instead of wearing it in. That's more likely these days. So like I said, for you to trust it, that's up to you. But as far as checking the quality of that gun, you really don't need much more than a box of ammo and some of your carry rounds, and you'll probably be good to go. All right, now I want to move on to our next segment, which is, I'm sure you can guess it, it's gun talk again. And I want to answer another question. A question I received in my live chat the other day is, can you explain the difference between a KFrame and an LFrame Smith & Wesson revolver? And after you explain the differences, can you tell us why they changed it and which is better? Well, it's pretty easy to explain the difference. If you look at this little illustration here, the difference between the KFrame and the LFrame is that the LFrame is a little taller. There's a little bit more room from the inside of that bottom frame to the top strap. And that means you can have a little bit bigger cylinder. In fact, the cylinder is about 1/10 of an inch thicker in diameter than a regular cylinder on a K-frame. Now that extra 1/10 of an inch is important because it made two big differences in the gun. The first big difference is you can fit an extra round in now. That bigger cylinder allows them to put a 7th round in that gun. Instead of being a 6-shot gun like the K-frame was, the L-frame can be a 6-shot gun, but it can also be a 7-shot gun. That's one big difference. And that's what makes the big difference for a lot of us. That's why if we buy a 686, we want the plus. That has the extra round. That's why I always tell people the best gun is the 686 plus or the 586 L comp, because those are both L frames. Now, a K-frame gun, another problem they had when it was shorter, Other than it having one less round, that's not really a problem. That's just an update. The problem with the shorter K-frames, why they did the change, is the way they were made and the way the barrels were done at the time. To have room for the crane and the ejector to fit properly into the gun, they actually had to shave a little bit off the forcing cone of the barrel. They just flattened out the bottom part of it just a tiny bit. Well, that was fine for years, but when Magnum loads started being more popular, and people start shooting more of them through the guns and more powerful ones, they start having problems with cracking. The forcing cone started to crack on some guns. So when they went to the L-frame, that left them a little bit more space between the top of the crane and the top of the gun and where the barrel sits, so they didn't have to put that little flat spot anymore. So that's the two big differences between the guns. That's the big change, is the height and the diameter of the cylinder. And the reasons it was done is it made it to where they didn't have to shave the barrel anymore, and it gave them room for another round. And that's pretty much all you need to know when it comes to the differences between those two guns, because the frames, as far as the grip frame, are the same. That's why you always see K/L frame grips. Stayed the same, no changes to that. It's just that they made it a little taller, added a round on some of them, and no longer had to shave the forcing cone. So that's no longer a problem in their guns. You don't have to worry about that. And if you really want to see a K-frame and an L-frame right next to each other, the modern versions, the ones you can see the most, are the 66 and the 69. The 66 is a 6-shot 357 Magnum. It's a K-frame. And the 69 is a 5-shot 44 Magnum on an L-frame. So they have those slight differences. The cylinder's a little thicker on the L-frame and it's a little taller. And like I said, that's pretty much the only difference. And those two things I mentioned are the advantages of going to the L-frame. All right, everybody, I want to end the show today, as usual, with our viewer EDC of the day. And today we have Chris M. from Nighthawk Custom. And since he does work for Nighthawk, he's carrying his custom Nighthawk 1911. This one happens to be the Thunder Ranch Combat Special. And he's carrying it with carbon fiber grips and in a very beautiful alligator holster. Now, when I first saw this picture, the first thing I thought is, this dude thinks he's better than me. Obviously, he's showing us his fancy gun in his fancy alligator holster with his fancy carbon fiber grips, and he's just rubbing it in our face that he did something with his life and he can afford a nice rig. Oh, and I can't afford a nice rig like that. He's what he's telling us. What he's doing. He's rubbing it in my face, trying to piss me off. And I know this is where people say, oh, it's just you. You've got immaturity issues. You've got anger issues. And you get mad at anyone who's done better than you, anyone that's more successful than you. You're just kind of a child. And like I said, you've got those anger issues. And that's bullshit. I do not have fucking anger issues. And any of you that fucking say that, you can take your goddamn fucking opinions and you can shove them up your mother. And there you go, our viewer EDC of the day, Chris M. with his Thunder Ranch Combat Special in his alligator holster with his carbon fiber grips. All right, everybody, that's our show for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you come back on Monday. I always take Saturday and Sunday off, so I'll see you next week. Until then, I just want to sign off by saying, as far as the state of the world today is concerned, it is what it is. But what things will be in the future, if we all keep level heads about us, we ignore the fearmongers and the profiteers and those that want to work against us on both sides of the aisle, what things will be in the future is better. I am a grown-ass man.